Greetings everyone, I'm Stefan, and this is a new and improved Civics tier list for Stellaris. The last Civics tier list I made was accurate for 2.2, but a lot of things have changed in the year of Stellaris updates. Basically, half of all the Civics have been shifted around, and some new ones have been added, so we'll make sure to take a look at that, as well as explain all the different rankings and the relative power structure. Instead of boring you guys with a description of what each Civic does, I'll just pull it up on screen and just talk about positives and negatives of the Civic without just stating the obvious. Today's video will cover all the standard ethics. Other types such as hive minds, machine empires, and megacorps will be covered in later videos, and those will probably be a little bit easier to do because normal empires have the most Civics out of all of them. Without further ado, let's begin by talking about fanatic purifiers. This really doesn't require too much of an explanation. This thing is extremely powerful, gives you a lot of fleet power, and the only one downside to it is that you can't use the pops as workers. You can only use them as forced servants, as in you can purge them with forced labor, and you can get some food and minerals from it. Besides that, it has a downside of being locked from the game start, and as you can see here on the Civics tier list, I have noted locked Civics with a little orange dash. The little D on the icon indicates that it's part of a DLC, and it doesn't get significantly better or worse over time. Next up, technocracy. Nothing really has changed with technocracy. Producing Unity from researchers means you can just spam researchers and ignore all sorts of other jobs such as Unity producers. It's extremely powerful, gives you more science, and is definitely one of the best things because tech rushing is meta. Due to similar reasons, meritocracy is also S tier, except instead of just boosting your science production, it boosts everything from specialists, and specialist jobs are really where you want your production to be. You also don't get that many bonuses for specialist jobs, and so the law of diminishing returns doesn't really apply there. If you had a Civic, for example, that gave you 10% mineral production, it would be way worse than a Civic that gave you 10% consumer goods production, because you get a lot of bonuses for mineral production, but not a lot for consumer goods. And so the 10% will be worth a lot more in the case of the consumer goods than it would be for the minerals. This does not significantly affect meritocracy, but it will be useful to know later on when talking about other Civics. Speaking of different Civics, let's move on to Tier A. This tier is slightly worse, but it is also extremely powerful. Inward Perfection pretty much disables diplomacy, but the bonuses you get from it are more than worthwhile. You also get special access to the adaptability tradition tree, which gives you extra building slots, extra habitability, and overall it's probably the best tradition tree in the entire game. Next up, we have slaver guilds. The 40% enslaved pop ratio is not as big of a problem as it used to be, because you can now employ slaves as specialists with the indentured servitude slavery type. This means that you can not only not worry about the 40% slave pop ratio, but you can also employ some slaves as specialists, and instead of consuming a bunch of upkeep as specialists usually do, they will consume practically nothing. The only problem with slavery now is that if your stability gets too low, you're pretty much screwed. So never get your stability too low, and you'll be alright. In fact, if your stability is always high, slavery guilds may even be an S tier Civic. It is very good, and slavery overall is very powerful. Next up, Agrarian Idyll. This Civic is very powerful in that in the early to mid game, it pretty much allows you to ignore ceded districts and amenities altogether. If you don't want to farm but you want to fight, Distinguished Admiralty is great because the bonuses it gives are solid, and hopefully you're going to be using those bonuses because otherwise it's of course worthless. If you're not using the bonuses mean nothing. Moving on to Tier B, we start with shared burdens. Now, if this was a preference-based list, this would of course be F- tier, but as a Civic, shared burdens is actually pretty good. The new living standard is not too special. You pay approximately as much consumer goods as you would normally, unless you have a bunch of robot pops. If you have a bunch of robots, which you ideally should have, you'll be paying a lot less consumer goods because those robots will occupy the lower tier jobs, and your specialists and rulers will get significantly reduced upkeep from shared burdens. In addition to the things listed on the tooltip, your luxury housing building gets replaced with a communal housing building, which instead of granting 5 amenities and 3 housing, grants 5 housing and 3 amenities. In my opinion, that's better than luxury housing, and is way more useful in the late game. Next up, we have Corporate Dominion. This Civic is only available if you don't have the Megacorp DLC enabled, and it basically just gives you a private colony ship, which is much cheaper than a regular colony ship. Considering how you'll be building plenty of those in the early game, it is quite worthwhile. However, later on, you probably want to switch out of it. Next, we got Merchant Guilds. This is a very worthwhile Civic because not only do you get some of your administrators replaced with merchants, which produce quite a bit more value, you can also form a trade league with another empire as a separate federation type. Of course, you need federations to actually use that aspect, but with federations, this is quite good. So far it seems that trade leagues are the best Federation type, and so going for merchant guilds to get the Federation type is certainly worthwhile. Next we got mining guilds. The fact that it adds base production to miners rather than a percentage bonus means that it is scalable and is equally as good at any point in the game. Next, functional architecture. You're going to end up saving a lot of resources with functional architecture, but this is probably the most boring civic in the game, so I generally don't go for it. Next up, Exalted Priesthood. Just like merchant guilds, it replaces administrators with better pops. However, it also increases the unity production from normal priests, and you can easily just spam those things and swim in unity. Normally going for a bit of unity is not worthwhile, but the amount of unity that this civic adds is insane. And now the new civic for standard empires for 2.6, Diplomatic Corps. The extra envoys you get are relatively worthwhile. You do want extra envoys, especially if you want extra weight in the Galactic Council, but if you don't care about that, it's not going to be a big deal, so it doesn't hurt you not to take it, but it's a nice bonus to take it. Moving on down the list of tier C, we have Barbaric Despoilers to start with. Barbaric Despoilers is not that good, but it is way better than it was before. You get access to the adaptability tree, which is quite good, just like Inward Perfection really. Your opinion penalty towards certain empires is just the same as it was before. However, the minus 60 opinion doesn't matter as much now as it used to before because neutral opinion range is at minus 200 to 200. So if you're within that range, you're pretty much good to go. The rating bombardment stance is just the same as Nihilistic Acquisition, which is an essential perk, so that's something. And Desperation Causes Belly, I guess that's nice. It's not too good, but it's decent. But anyways, moving down the list, we have Warrior Culture. Warriors are better than entertainers and are actually kind of worthwhile. They produce 12 amenities instead of the base 10 amenities, which is not that much, but you also get plenty of extra naval cap and a bit extra unity, as far as I remember. The civic pairs especially well with habitats and you can monopolize because on those two things you have special districts that actually give you entertainers, which are then converted into duelists, which then convert the district into fleet cap. And so in the end you can get a lot of naval capacity very easily from just a bunch of duelists. Moving on, we have Aristocratic Elite. This civic has been nerfed in 2.6 for whatever reason. It wasn't that strong before. And now aristocrats produce unity and stability instead of amenities and stability. The problem with that is that with the civic, you actually start the game with negative amenities, which is not fun at all. There also isn't a very good way to get more nobles. These guys replace some of your administrators, and the only way to get more of them is to build a noble estates building, which costs a building slot and a bunch of resources for a single noble. It's really not worthwhile, and honestly you're better off going with either share burdens or police state for your stability. Next up, Beacon of Liberty. You get a pretty decent unity bonus from it, and that's all there is to it. Next, we have Imperial Cult. As cool as that may sound, it is actually relatively mediocre. Next, Cutthroat Politics. This actually serves a very similar function to the Imperial Cult. The minus 20% edict cost is very similar in effect to the plus 25% edict duration, but you don't get the extra governing ethics extraction from it. You don't end up saving a lot of influence from Cutthroat Politics or Imperial Cult, so they're relatively low on the list. Next up, we got the Oi Mate. Do you have a license for that TV civic? And this one is relatively alright. You get extra stability, which is especially good if you're playing a slaver empire. Next up, Citizen Service. Honestly, the extra unity from soldiers doesn't matter too much. You won't have a lot of soldiers at any point in the game unless you're trying to specifically fortify a certain world, but the extra naval capacity is nice. Up next, Parliamentary System. As of 2.6.2, your ethics are generally very spread out across your population, and so getting a lot of influence from factions is relatively hard. It does give you plenty of extra influence, but it is honestly on the same level as Cutthroat Politics and Imperial Cult, so it is ranked down low with them. Up next, Free Haven. This civic is quite alright if you got migration packs going with other empires, but of course, I don't know why the hell you would have migration packs going with Xeno empires. You also need Xenophile for this, which is not part of the criteria for the Civics tier list, but it does hurt. I just have to say, playing Xenophile hurts. Hurts me at least. Moving on down the list, we have a D tier, but before we cover these awful civics, I want to give a quick shout out to my Discord server for helping me make this amazing tier list. and especially to people like Rigunas and Color Code that really helped me reconsider some of the civics on this list. Anyways, let's move on further with efficient bureaucracy. This civic is just meh. Like, a lot of the civics in D tier and F tier are gonna be meh. That's the word I'm gonna use to describe them. Honestly, we can wrap up D tier and F tier really quickly. Efficient bureaucracy, meh. Byzantine bureaucracy, meh. Now I do have to mention that Byzantine bureaucracy has been nerfed significantly. It used to give you minus 10% to amenities and housing usage, as well as provide you with a building for extra admin jobs. Now it just gives you unity and stability from bureaucrats, which is really terrible considering how you're not going to have a lot of bureaucrats in your empire. Let's just say you're 50 and you have a massive empire, so you need 20 bureaucrats. Okay, so that's 20 stability and 20 unity. At that point, you might as well pick anything else, because bureaucrats are just, they're not good. Next, Corvée, or Corvée, or however it's pronounced, Covfefe system. Pop growth from immigration is nice, but the reduced resettlement cost isn't really worthwhile. Idealistic foundation, meh. Now, if this gave 5 stability, this would be relatively alright. It still would be much worse than police state, because police state just gives you more stuff in addition to extra stability. But the 5% happiness translates to roughly 3 stability, and the 3 stability translates into roughly 2% extra resources. 2% extra resources, you can do better than that. Next, Shadow Council, verdict, meh. As much as I would like to like it, because it was buffed in 2.6, it really does not provide enough value to make it worthwhile. The ruler pop resource output plus 10% only modifies unity production on your rulers and possibly science production if you're running science directors. The reason for this is that amenities production and trade value production is not affected whatsoever by extra resource output, and so you're not getting that much value out of this thing. A plus 10% to unity from ruler jobs is really bad, and the minus 75% to election influence cost is really bad as well. It's just a combination of 2 really bad things that does not provide enough value to make it even C tier. Moving on down the list, we have F tier, or civics that you never ever want to choose. Environmentalist is one of them, although it is probably the best of the F tier civics. The reduction to consumer goods upkeep is nice, but it only affects upkeep. It does not affect any sort of production upkeep, such as the one for researchers or bureaucrats, and the minus 10% is really not enough to make it a worthwhile civic. If it was like 30%, yeah, I would consider it, but minus 10% is not worthwhile. Moving on, we have probably the worst civic in the game, Feudal Society. Yeah, it reduces subject power relations penalty by 50%, and it also allows your vassals to expand. But realistically, you want to expand, you don't want your vassals to expand, so taking Feudal Society is not worthwhile. And to finish off today's tier list, we have Philosopher King. This civic is just bad. Like, it's bad. It has been buffed in 2.6 to prevent your rulers and governors from gaining negative traits upon leveling up, but it's still bad. The ruler level cap plus 2 is useless up until year 80 or so, at which point your ruler is either about to die or has become immortal already, at which point, yeah, maybe you can get some usage out of it, but up to that point, nothing. The one upside to Philosopher King is that it may prevent a single governor from gaining Arrested Development upon leveling up, but honestly, that's relatively rare, and you're not getting a lot of value out of this civic, just period. Don't use this. Anyways, that about does it for today. Stick around the channel, and soon I'll be uploading the Hive Mind, the Machine Empire, and the Megacorp Civics tier lists for your enjoyment. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.